I have a question for Phyllis, especially because it relates to action. You mentioned several things about the front end that we can be doing. But I have something about the back end. I'm sort of reluctant to ask it because I think doing things on the front end to stop the killing is really where I should be. But the question I have is, what about the refugees, the Syrian refugees? This is a horrible, horrible disaster. I'm particularly concerned. There seems to be 3 countries that are just taking the total brunt of this. You know, Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon, and it's tearing at the fabric of Lebanon. It's very, very fragile. And it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get much, much worse. How should we be responding to this?
We're going to make you run tonight.
It's a really crucial question. When I said earlier that we need to be demanding more money paid to humanitarian concerns, that means more money going directly to the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, more money directly going to refugee care. Now, the tricky part is there's a desperate need for immediate funds. I mean, among other things, the World Food Program has had to cut by 40% its rations to Syrian refugees because there's no money in its accounts. The U.S. can do something about that. Take some of the money that it's spending on war and send it to the refugee agencies, UNICEF, the World Food Program, etc. Now, the tricky part is, it's not enough to provide food and tents. The question of resettlement is obviously an issue. Most refugees are not, from what I've been understanding, are not yet prepared to say they want to be relocated somewhere else. One of the travesties of our government is our consistent refusal to take refugees, to settle them here. If we look at the history of the U.S. in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly in Iraq, where there were thousands of Iraqis who were promised protection by the soldiers they fought with, translators, fighters, all kinds of people, who were then just put in the queue to go to the State Department and have your application vetted, and something like 11 get approved each year. It's criminal. It's absolutely criminal. There needs to be attention paid to that. That means letters to the editor, letters to your member of Congress. Don't forget, when you write a letter to the editor of your local paper, if you use the name of your congressperson, whether they did something good and you praise them, rarely, or they did something crummy and you condemn them, more likely, or they did nothing and you want them to, most likely of all, if their name is in it, their staff is going to read it. The first thing the staff does every morning is Google the name of their boss to find out whether they've been in the news. Write those letters, get them in the local paper, and include the name of your member. But the care for the refugees is a crucial part of our obligations.
Can I comment on that? Can I comment as well? I know the question was for Phyllis, but the UNHCR actually has a good suggestion for dealing with, like an outline for dealing with displaced people around the world. And the 2 major issues that we always talk about are resettlement to third countries or helping ease their suffering while they're in transit now in refugee camps or urban areas. And these are the things that we usually discuss in the US. But the number 1 solution is voluntary repatriation. And that's in the case of Syrians or Iraqis, should be the solution. So we shouldn't forget that this is not a humanitarian crisis that started because of a natural disaster. There was no tsunami there. There was a political and military disaster that caused that. And without addressing the root causes of that, we can't get the millions of Iraqis and Syrians to go back home. So I mean, in a way, it's not only a humanitarian crisis, it is a political crisis as well. And when we talk about solving the conflicts in Iraq and Syria, that's not only a political solution, it is also a humanitarian solution that would help millions of people go back home.
Hi, my name is Richard. I'm having a little trouble with the basic context that war is not the solution. There was a funny little joke well, not a joke, but a little story that Krishna once asked Bush, well, you're in trouble now. It's 2008. Looks like your economy's not doing well. Well, Bush just said, don't worry about it, we'll just start a war. Well, it sounds like a joke, but Obama, since he's gotten into office, has sold more arms than anybody else in the history of humanity. Over $169 billion. Okay? Much of that in the Middle East. We're not alone. Every other big capitalist country is in a major arms race. Now, Paul Barron and Paul Swayze back in the late 50s talked about this. No, I'm making a comment. They talked about this book called Monopoly Capital, in which they specified very concisely that overproduction has a tendency, is a tendency of capital system. What does overproduction do? It drives down wages. What are we going through right now? Austerity throughout the entire world. The only way that we can revive the economy is to destroy factories, to destroy the productive processes all around the world. What is the United States doing all around the world and its allies? Ukraine, Libya, all around the world. They're destroying productive capacities and they're selling arms. Why are they doing it? Because that's the only way they can
Ask
keep
your
the...
question, will you?
I'm doing comments. I'm doing comments. Okay? We're allowed comments. Okay? I'm finished. I'll be finished. Okay? War, we are as addicted to war as we are addicted to our little pharmaceutical pills that a lot of us taking here, and cocaine and all the other little drugs. This is a very addicted country. The problem is the syphilis lies within us and the capitalist system.
Thank you. Any comments?
Okay, let's take it.
There's been talk about another conference and all, but I'm asking the panel if you all would comment on the recent Syrian election, how it was conducted, who voted, who didn't vote. Among the Syrian people, what is the degree of legitimacy of the government? And for the Syrian people, what is their path forward?
Maybe I can take some more questions and then saves time.
I have a question, why we haven't been able to engage other major powers that are more or less neutral in this matter, as we apparently were trying to do about a year ago, and there seemed to be some success. I'm afraid that the U.S. has lost so much credibility that no one believes what we say anymore. And so how do we get around that problem that we've essentially poisoned our own credibility, which of course makes us unable to really arrive at any solutions?
Let's take 3 questions and then
in demystifying Syria, I was hoping that louder. In demystifying Syria, I was hoping that the panel would start off with the nature of the Syrian government, and if there was an uprising to overthrow that government, and how it evolved and all that. It was the role of Syrian people was mostly absent in the conversation and the presentation of the panel, as if this was all mostly a conspiracy by the U.S. and the role of the Syrian government in the rise of ISIS by allowing the Salafi prisoners to be released from Syrian prisons so that the Islamists would become a more powerful opposition group. So every opposition group could be labeled as Salafis or Islamists. So please, to do justice to the Syrian people, tens of thousands of people have died, millions have been refugees and displaced. For the sake of the Syrian people, please address the cause of this uprising in Syria.
let's have the panel, then I do 3 more.
I'll take a look at 2 of the questions on the Syrian, well, not so much on the Syrian elections, actually, I'm not going to touch that. On the question of the role of the U.S. and other major powers, I think it's important to recognize the U.S. is not responsible for the earlier efforts to bring together global negotiations around Syria. The U.S. was a major part of the stumbling block of why it didn't work. Part of the reason was the U.S. was the country that refused to allow, as if it had the right to determine who would be there and who not, it was the US who said, Iran cannot be at the table, which is a guarantee for failure. You know, this was the lesson that former Senator George Mitchell talked about after the Good Friday Accord in Northern Ireland. If you're serious about diplomacy, everybody has to be at the table. Because if they're not, it's not going to work. It doesn't matter whether you think they're terrorists or you don't like them or you don't trust them. That's not the point. The point is, if everybody's not at the table, somebody is being given permission to undermine the agreement, and that's exactly what happened. On the question of the role of the Syrian People's Agency, I think it's absolutely right, and I do think that we too often don't talk about that. Some of us write about it a lot and talk about it in other arenas, but in very short presentations where the goal is to get people to work, it is important to keep the focus on the US. So I would defend that, but I do think it's important to recognize that this did start as it did in Egypt, as it did in Yemen, as it did in Libya, as the Arab Spring with all of its local and national particularities throughout the region, began as people rising up, demanding justice, demanding an end to the humiliation of living under dictatorship, demanding ultimately the right of citizenship. The nature of the regime in in Syria was a very mixed bag. It was a regime that economically had a smaller gap between rich and poor than almost any other country in the region, but was incredibly repressive towards political opponents. It was a government that claimed to be part of a resistance arc against US imperialism, against Zionism, etc., but which collaborated deliberately with Israel in attacking Palestinians, which collaborated with the United States on allowing the US to send prisoners to Syria to be tortured during the so-called global war on terror. So it was a very mixed bag, and it's not surprising that there was an uprising against it, which at the beginning, we should note, was not calling for an overthrow of the regime. For the first 6 months, the call was for reforms. It also has to be recognized that this is not a government that everyone in the country hates. It has a base of support, and it has from the beginning, and it continues to. So it's a very complicated reality. The one other thing I would say before turning it over to my colleagues is that I think we do need to keep our focus on what role the United States plays. It's important to understand all the regional dynamics, but the most important thing I would assert is to understand what our own government is doing in our name with our tax money. Because at the end of the day, that's what we can change. We cannot make Israel end its occupation. We can be part of campaigns like the BDS movement that is going to ultimately make it much more difficult for the Israeli government to maintain its occupation and apartheid policies. But we can't do that for them. We are not Israelis. We can't change the nature of the Syrian regime, but we can prevent our government from bombing Syria. And that, I think, is what becomes our main obligation.
I'll try to answer those three individuals that they raised very important questions. One of them is that if you ask me today, under what worldwide condition we are living, whether we are in Asia, Africa, Oceania, or America, or Europe, I would say empire of chaos. What we see today in the world is empire of chaos. Now, within this empire of chaos, the head of the system, that's the United States, the head of the system is responsible for creating this empire of chaos. In fact, Daesh or IS or ISIS or ISL is byproduct of US policy in the Middle East. United States and its allies, so-called allies, they succeeded in Iraq. Regime change was successful. In Libya, they succeeded. Remember, their purpose is what? Clash of civilizations and increasing the degree of empire of chaos. In Syria, they failed. After 4 years, they were not able to overthrow a dictator like Bashar Assad. No matter how much Bashar Assad was undemocratic, despotic, but Bashar Assad, for many, many reasons that now we understand, enjoyed full support of 40% of its population. Yes, you are right. There was uprising, genuine Arab Spring, in fact started in Syria. But that genuine Arab Spring immediately was taken over by outsiders. Remember, today, forces that are loyal to Daesh, IS, in Iraq and in Syria, major portion of that population that they are fighting for IS, they are not only they are not Syrians, but they are not Arabs. And great number of them, very close to 10,000 of them, are Europeans. They come from Stockholm all the way down to Spain. They are European citizens fighting inside Syria. That's why some scholars like Immanuel Wallerstein and Samir Amin, they believe that it would be wrong to say war in Vietnam, war in Korea, war in Iraq, but civil war in Syria. It's not a civil war. It's exactly like one of those wars. So Empire of Chaos has created what we see today, Syria, where this empire didn't succeed to overthrow, didn't succeed regime change. So they resorted to what? Daesh. Now, read background of Daesh. Who is the leader of Daesh today? Al-Baghdadi, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. His real name is Ibrahim Samari. Let us see who was his mentor, his spiritual leader, outside of jail and inside jail. Before he became al-Baghdadi. Abu Mus'ab Zarqawi. Abu Mus'ab Zarqawi was mentor of, or spiritual leader of al-Baghdadi. What happened to Abu Mus'ab? Abu Mus'ab was assassinated in the year 2006. Then al-Baghdadi succeeded him and changed the name to IS. Now, who was Abu Mus'ab? Abu Mus'ab Zarqawi, a Jordanian from small city Zarqav in Jordan. He is the same guy that was used as a witness by Colin Powell in the UN to prove that Osama bin Laden meets regularly with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. This is the same guy that his student today is the leader of IS, or Khalifa of IS, Abu Bakr. So I would say I don't really expect that this empire of chaos and consequences, ramifications of this empire will disappear unless we move in direction of completely bringing a change to the nature and quality of leadership in the United States.
Thanks. I want to reiterate what Phyllis said about our role as American citizens or as a country in these conflicts, and that is something important for us to focus on during these events. You know, how can we push for a more responsible U.S. engagement internationally or with countries such as Syria and Iraq? And the fact that the U.S. is now an active player in those conflicts, whether directly by bombarding those countries or indirectly by funding and training proxy groups in the ground, on the ground in Iraq and Syria. We're spending billions of dollars in Iraq and Syria funding and training groups who have been committing massive human rights violations. And my organization, AFSC, has been working, for example, to try to push the US government to implement the Leahy laws. Leahy laws are a set of laws that are supposed to prohibit the US government from funding state actors who are engaged in massive human rights violations. So we continue to do that, unfortunately, in Iraq. In Syria, there are a different set of laws that are supposed to prohibit that US role. Now, that wouldn't end the conflict, of course. That should be a part of a larger picture of ending conflicts. But without stopping the flow of arms and the US intervention, we can't start discussing the larger picture. That's why ending the US bombing and ending US funding to proxy groups is an extremely important first step towards dealing with these conflicts. I wanted to comment briefly about the issue of collaboration between the Syrian and Iraqi governments and ISIS and other terrorist groups. There are a million conspiracy theories out there. And these conspiracy theories don't really come out of nowhere. There are conspiracies on Iraq and Syria that have been destroying the country. There is a situation that has been created purposefully to have this violence and chaos, unverifiable, violence and chaos. We can't really call ISIS and ask them if they are behind attacks. They don't have a media department with a spokesperson. You can't really talk to them. You can't try to reach out to Al-Qaeda and interview them, These things happen in complete chaos and in the dark in Iraq and Syria. Now, there are some cases of documented collaboration, or at least what seems to be Iraqi and Syrian governments benefiting from the existence of ISIS. So it seems like there are at least 3 cases of, the one that you mentioned about releasing what becomes leaders of ISIS in Iraq and Syria by the Iraq and Syrian government, intentional withdrawals from oil fields in Iraq and Syria that ends up being taken control by some extremist groups, and other details about how the presence of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, although it's very violent, it's not inconvenient for the narratives of the Syrian and Iraqi governments. Look at these crazy terrorist groups who are opposing us. It makes the Iraqi and Syrian governments look like humane and nice and civilized when you compare them to that. Of course, when there was a genuine uprising against the government in Syria or in Iraq, there were months of protests without ISIS there. In Iraq, there was an entire year of a sit-in in Fallujah and in Hawija. There was no ISIS there either. Those are harder to defeat with public opinion. So I agree with the premise that, in some cases, it might make sense that these governments have been investing in making ISIS and other extremist groups even bigger, because it's not an inconvenient thing for them. The fact that, 35% of Iraq's territories fell in 3 days by an army that has tens of billions of dollars of equipment and funds, to a group of 5,000 people in trucks. Yeah, there are some question marks about that. There are some question marks about the situation in Syria. But you can't really prove it. And the evidence that we have so far is very marginal. So I wouldn't really think of that as a part of a bigger major conspiracy theory. I mean, there are real forces of extremism in the region. That people are more extreme. That people become more extreme during war. And thinking about that in a real way, that when the US interferes and other countries interfere and drop bombs, we are creating conditions for more extremism. The theme that we can eliminate extremism by dropping bombs should not pass the lab test. Now that is the theory of our engagement in Iraq, that we will bomb Iraq into stabilization and make Iraq more moderate by bombing it. These things will not happen. So anyway, I just want to say that there is evidence there, and that is not crazy evidence, that both the Iraqi and Syrian governments have helped create more space so that these crazy groups will become larger. That doesn't mean that these governments have been leading the groups or have invented the groups either.
Actually, I do have a question for Dr. Yanez. I need you to correct me. Am I wrong that in American history, dictators and entities like ISIS are actually created and then wars are financed against them? I'm not sure exactly. There were some numbers mentioned here by the $170 billion of military equipment sold within the past 5 years. This has been unknown. Nobody in the history has ever sold this much of military equipment. And as far as I know, I'm a clinician, I'm not a politician. The little bit that I know, I'm assuming a bit of it is going to entities like ISIS too. Now, am I wrong that, is it my imagination that ISIS is just one more entity to stimulate the economy in this country? It almost looks like Al-Qaeda gets exhausted, ISIS comes to picture, and then Hamas is soon going to transform to something else. So isn't it all going back to the economic needs in this country?
Okay, so 2 more questions.
This question is for Phyllis actually. You mentioned that we should call the Senator Cardin, or I'm sorry, I don't know his name, and try to make him change the whole perspective and the outcome of the event. But I don't know, in your heart, do you really think that will do anything good? I mean, there were so many demonstrations before the Desert War, daily demonstrations, and nobody listened, and they went ahead and, killed about 500,000 people. So my question is this: do you really think that will do anything good?
Yes, I watch you lots of time in the TRN and other social media. I want to thank you very much because I learn a lot about Middle East. Now, I have just a very brief question. Oslo Agreement was about 22 years ago, I believe. Based on that treaty or agreement, that 13% of the land of Palestine they dedicated for, they assigned for Palestine. After agreement, all of that, we know that, what the Israelis they did. They start importing the land, they start we did go through Intifada and all this type of stuff. Nothing happens. At this time, it's just 2% of those 13% is remain. And all those 2%, there are roads, there are walls, they separate the villages, the family, and all this. My question mainly is, okay, I believe DBS or DBS. Okay, it's a very progressive movement that we see particularly in Europe and very little in the United States. But what I want to say, what this BDS, how BDS can stop Israelis to do this type of aggression and criminal act. You know the Israelis, they sell military equipment to United States. If you look at those figures, you'll be surprised that they take the technology of this country to Israel and sell it back to United States. What I want to ask you, okay, what other option remain? If nothing for Palestinians remain. Thanks.
Okay, so on the first question about the value of pressuring Congress, the answer is it going to work right away? No, it's not. Are you going to be able to convince Cardin to change his vote? Maybe, maybe not. Is it true that in 2002 and 2003, when the world said no to war and there were between 12 and 14 million people pouring into the streets on one day, on February 15th of 2003, saying no to Bush's war, that yes, they went ahead anyway and did it? Does that mean that protest doesn't matter? No. That movement, that protest, that mobilization set the stage for a whole new kind of global mobilizations we had never seen before, which are now taken for granted. Of course we can have global mobilizations on anything we want, but we never did until February 15th of 2003. So that was a hugely important historic mobilization. Now, I would also point to what happened in the summer of 2013, when President Obama said he was going to bomb Syria because of the allegations that were never proved, but were asserted over and over again, so people started to just assume it, about the use of chemical weapons in Syria. It was a red line, he crossed the red line, we've got a bomb. But remember what happened? There was a huge mobilization that followed the decision of the British Parliament, which followed a mobilization there of our friends and comrades in the Stop the War Coalition, to pressure the British Parliament to say no to Obama's war. And then when Obama, in response, kicked it over to Congress, so that he wouldn't have to make the decision in the face of the British withdrawal from a so-called coalition, the peace movement, our movement, kicked into high gear over 6 weeks and got millions of visits and calls and letters and emails to members of Congress who started saying, wait a minute, my phones aren't working because they're jamming. People are calling too much. We're getting calls 400 to 1 telling us not to allow a new war. And it worked. They pulled back. They didn't allow the vote because they knew it wasn't going to work. And they didn't bomb Syria for a year. And then someone will say, well, yeah, but a year later they did it again. Yeah, that's right, because this is a war economy and war is what this country does. But if we can stop one war for 1 year, that's a year's worth of children not being killed. That's pretty damn important to me. So the answer is, yeah, it's worth it. It's boring, it's stupid, it feels like it's useless, and if you don't do it, it's going to be 10 years later than the 10 years it might take if we start now. It might take 10 years, but if we don't start for 10 years, it's going to take 20 years. So I don't think we have a whole lot of choice. If we're serious about changing our country, which then changes the world, we have to engage with power. We don't bring money to the table. And most of the time we can't even claim we bring votes to the table. We're not like lobbyists. We're not like AIPAC. We're not like the military contractors lobby. We're not like the military manufacturers lobbies, who bring billions of dollars and claim to bring thousands of votes to the table. We're not that. We bring moral suasion, and we bring the reality that they need the small donors, and they need the people walking the precincts to get elected, AIPAC or no AIPAC. We fought against AIPAC in 2013 and we won. So saying it can't ever happen simply means we're not prepared to try. It's kind of similar to the question about BDS. The Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, which was called for by Palestinian civil society just 10 years ago this coming summer, 2005, has been perhaps the most extraordinary kind of resistance movement that the world has seen since the overthrow of apartheid in South Africa. And what a surprise, it was based on the same principle. It took the South Africans more than 50 years of calling for divestment from banks doing business in South Africa, divesting from corporations making a profit on apartheid. BDS has been around only 10 years, and it's already having a huge impact. When Netanyahu comes to the United States and speaks to AIPAC or speaks to the Council of Presidents of major Jewish organizations, what he always starts with is, we have two strategic threats to Israel. One is Iran. The other is BDS. Last year at APAC, he spent half his speech condemning those who would assert the right of boycott, the right to bring nonviolent economic pressure to bear on Israel. And you know why it'll work? Not today, not tomorrow, not for probably 5 more years. But the reason it's going to work, the reason that it will make Israel a different place than it is today, is that up until today, Israelis, most Israelis, are not suffering from the occupation. This line about the status quo is unsustainable, it's absolutely not true. For Israel, the status quo is fundamentally sustainable. It's problematic at times, but not really. At the end of the day, Israel does not face a strategic threat on its borders or within its borders. What is at threat is its privileges. Its privileges of being an apartheid state. So yeah, the possibility of maintaining Jewish privilege, where Jews like me can get all kinds of privileges. They're not rights, because rights go to everybody. These are privileges that only go to Jews, that don't go to non-Jews. That can change. That will change. When BDS starts to fight. When Israelis, for South Africans, for white South Africans, the issue was sports. When their beloved Springboks could no longer play in the World Cup, that turned around white South Africans. For Jewish Israelis, it's not about sports. I mean, Jews are not so good with sports, I gotta say. When I was a kid in high school, where half our school was Jewish, the only teams that ever won was the chess team. Kind of embarrassing. But it's not about sports, but it's about culture and science. So when dance troupes and films and artists stop going to play Tel Aviv because of the boycott, and when scientists can't get their institutions in institutional relationships with US institutions, they can do what they want as individuals, because the boycott has never been against individuals. But it means they can't get their individual universities to have those institutional relationships. There's going to be a pushback. Because those Israelis believe that they live in a European country. That's the point. They're not worried about that they don't have a good relationship with their neighbors. They're not interested in their neighbors. They're interested in Europe. And if they can't have the kinds of relationships with Europe and Europeans that they want, it's not going to be the kind of country that they want. And they're going to start looking about why is that? And the answer is going to be occupation and apartheid. So that's why BDS is important. Now, it doesn't, for the whole world, BDS is the most important strategy. Here in the US, we have another one. BDS, yes, but also the direct focus on the role of the United States in providing $3.2 billion a year in military aid directly to the Israeli military, the 25th wealthiest country in the world, and the protection of Israel in the United Nations so it's never held accountable for its potential war crimes. That makes Israel able to do a lot of things it couldn't do without it. So I would assert that we have a double job. We have BDS, and we have to work against US support for Israeli crimes, because that makes us complicit. When it's our name, our tax money, we become responsible. And I don't like being responsible for other people's crimes.
My friend Farnash, you raised a good question about Daesh and the contradiction there. Huh? But remember, when Daesh invaded from Syria into Iraq, and they took over the city of Mosul, and they started beheading, including 3 Americans. What was Obama's plan? That we are going to make a coalition of countries to take care of Daesh. Charade. Nothing happened. With the power that the United States has, NSA, how it is possible to accept that not only they didn't take care of Daesh, but they let Daesh to go to Egypt and massacre Christian workers, in Libya, Christian workers from Egypt, and create complete chaos in Libya. Plus the same Daesh went into Tunisia and created the same condition in Tunisia, later on in Yemen, by attacking the Shiite mosques. So, in fact, not only Daesh was not demolished, which they could do it in a matter of nights and days, not weeks and months, but they somehow let Daesh to go in those 3 countries and create what today we see. And that is Vietnamization of war in Middle East. In other words, Daesh will go and instigate that conflict between Shiite and Muslims, and the whole Middle East, greater Middle East, will be completely almost the same way that Nixon and Kissinger planned to do it in Southeast Asia around Vietnam, but they failed. And I hope this policy will fail too.
I just want to give a very short remark because I know that we're 15 minutes late already. So I just encourage everyone to go to our organization's website, afsc.org. We're actually one of the largest national organizations in the US who support BDS. And we have a special tool that we just started using publicly. It's on afsc.org/investigate. So investigate.afsc.org. You can look up if you suspect of any companies have been investing inside Israel or in settlements. You can write any company's name and the system will give you information about that company and whether it has any investments inside Israel. So it's actually very useful to see whether it's a food company or whether it's a company that invests in your retirement portfolio. You can go there and write their names and then they will look up all of these things. I completely agree with Phyllis that BDS in the US is not as big as other countries, but it's still an extremely strong political message that can be sent. It hasn't really reached to the point that it can create enough economic pressure yet, but I think the work that is being done on campuses around the US, passing resolutions and other type of work that you can find on afsc.org/investigate is very interesting. It's a very strong tool that we can mobilize regarding Israel.
Unfortunately, our time is beyond the limit we had, so I want to thank you everyone who helped make this event possible, and also our distinguished speakers who
Good to see you again.
Great to see you. I really appreciate it. Is that how to do it for me?